Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Quick Investigating Tips for Fire Sprinkler Claims. My name is Mary Jo Cusella. I'm a partner in our Tampa office and handle a lot of claims for the folks who are attending the webinar today. So today we are going to talk about a quick guide to investigating fire sprinkler subrogation claims. There's going to be a discussion of the different types of systems that are involved, what to look for, so that we can quickly identify and efficiently, cost-effectively too, identify these subrogation claims that may end up having a recovery for your company. One of the two key factors to look at in the subrogation investigations, I think, is the age of the systems as well as the location where your property loss is located at. So we're going to need to collect some data early on. You also want to know right away whether the pipe involved is a wet or a dry system. A lot of times we'll get losses that come across our desk and it'll say broken pipe at the building. We don't know if it's a fire sprinkler pipe or if it's a water line, if it supplies water to a piece of equipment, say a water heater. We need to specifically identify, first of all, it's a fire sprinkler loss. And then once you identify that it's a fire sprinkler loss, we need to know if it's a wet or a dry system. Those are key in quickly identifying subrogation potential, as well as the age of the building and the age of the fire sprinkler system, because the fire sprinkler systems a lot of times will be installed after the building is originally constructed. And the age is important because you need to calculate your statute of limitations, your statute of repose. The statute of repose for construction claims in Florida is 10 years. Now that's the definite last time that you could file a claim against the original installer would be 10 years from the date that their work was performed. And then the negligence standard of statute of limitations in Florida would be 4 years. The statute of repose in Texas is 10 years, similar to Florida, and the negligence statute of limitations would be 2 years. So you need to figure out where your property is located at. And as you know, there are different statute of limitations and statute of repose for every single state. If you have any questions about specific states, feel free to give me a call, reach out to our office. And the other quick tip to identify is the weather data. Not only are we looking at the date of the loss weather, you want to know what is going on in the area, in the surrounding area, a few days prior to the water loss event. If you have sub-zero temperatures for extended three-day period, a lot of that goes into the factoring of whether or not we're going to have good subrogation potential. Some more quick tips as to gathering information is, oops, I skipped one of these. Okay, going back. Is you want to know if the building was occupied. You want to know if there was heat, if you have a freeze claim, if there was heat on at the building, whether the property was vacant, how long it had been vacant. It's important to know whether the building was occupied, or even if it's in one unit, perhaps a unit next door to the insured's loss unit was not heated. You could have surrounding units that are shut down and there's no heat on, which could contribute to a freeze incident. You'll want to know the repair history and by whom, and gather as much information as you can as quickly as possible so that you can place certain parties on notice if needed. You'll need the installation and the service maintenance contract. Those are going to be two separate documents. When you ask for the installation contract, I typically ask for the contract between, if the insured is the owner of the building, the original contract for construction with the general contractor, and then the subcontractor fire sprinkler. Typically, the insured will enter into a general contract for the construction of the building with the general contractor, and then the general contractor will sub out to the fire sprinkler. You see it sometimes, though, that the insured would contract directly with the fire sprinkler contractor, so you'll need to gather all those documents. You'll also need the latest testing and inspection records. Those would be obtained from a fire service maintenance contractor. It would be similar to your maintenance contract. A lot of times insureds do not have service maintenance contracts in place, and they simply call on the contractor to perform the annual or semi-annual testings of the systems. And you want to gather those testing and inspection records because they will have certain check boxes that are applicable to whether or not they properly drained all the water lines and evacuated all the water from the system. That's what you're looking for. And to see what other scope of repairs that may have been performed. Power outages are another important thing to consider, because if you have power out at a property and you have a freeze loss and the heat was not maintained or on at the property because of the power outage, that's another factor to consider when we're looking at freeze losses. And gather the remains of pieces of pipe fitting. That's going to be critical for a fire protection engineer to inspect. A lot of times we will work really hard on trying to find these broken pieces, and the earlier the better that you can inform the insured to do not throw anything away. It may look like garbage, but it's precious evidence to us. A lot of times they'll just be laying around somebody's office, or say a fire sprinkler repair contractor took them. We chase down that fire sprinkler contractor. We ask, we'll call, who was the technician? We'll call that technician. Maybe it's on his truck still. Get those pieces so that everything can be evaluated by your expert. It's going to be very important. And then, of course, with any loss, you'll want to ask for witness statements. You know, who saw what, when, you know, why, how. Talk to as many people who were at the property, if anybody, witnessed the loss itself. And then later on, all that stuff is pretty much early investigation, gathering information. And here's an alert. Here is your first code. See the pencil at the bottom of the slide here. And you'll want to ask for the building's drawings, specifications, and permits. This is going to provide your expert the information as to how the system was designed, and then if there's any installation issues, they can see how it was designed, how it was supposed to be put together, and then compare it with what is out in the field, and if there's any problems with the system as it was installed, and who did the work. Permits can be obtained sometimes from the insured or through the building department. The fire alarm control panel has information. The fire alarm control panel, it's a controlling component of the fire alarm system, and it receives information from devices of the fire sprinkler system, and it monitors the operational integrity and provides automatic control of equipment. And it's a big source of a transmission of information. And it also supplies electrical energy to operate the fire sprinkler devices. And it has like a data recorder in it. And that will give you important times when things are triggered, when they're noticing, for example, a trouble alert. So that's a wealth of information too. The fire pump controller data tape is something else that can be downloaded by a fire sprinkler expert. And those are control panels that contain electrical components such as circuit breakers and switches and relays and other devices that are dedicated to the operation of the fire pumps themselves that are found inside of mechanical rooms. And all these different various component parts work together to make up the fire sprinkler system at the property. Monitoring company records are also very important. They monitor the life and safety devices at the property. They will alert fire departments, police departments. They'll record any activity inside of the building, like where did the first, like water, where was the first source of water identified? It'll send an alarm. So all that information is more critical for the expert to isolate where the initial loss occurred and maybe what was happening out there. Phone records, with really any investigation, phone records can always be an important part. If you need to, you can always request 911 records, so on and so forth. Fire and police department records, and I needed to include here too, fire marshal records have a wealth of information because they have to come out on a regular basis and do life safety checks at the properties, and it does include fire sprinkler systems, so you can find a wealth of information in the fire marshal's office as well. Surveillance videos, security panel data, all that information is, the security panel data is tied in with like the monitoring company records, utility records, what was the output of water that, you know, the property sustained before the water was shut off. That's going to be important when you're going to prove your damages against a responsible party in a subrogation case, because you're going to have to tell them where all the water came from. And if you can show a surge in water at the time of the loss from the water department, that will assist if you're also your supporting data. Your cellular phone videos, photographs of whoever might have any to help with your subrogation investigation as well. And hiring experts. A lot of people will hire mechanical engineers when you have which can be okay in a fire sprinkler loss case. However, a commercial type loss, something that's going to be highly technical, it's better to have a fire protection engineer on board. There are few fire protection engineers out there. There's not as many fire protection engineers as there are mechanical engineers. Mechanical engineers are quickly available. Fire protection engineers, especially when you have a huge wave of fire sprinkler losses, may take some time to get them out to look at a property because they're very busy. But if you have any questions about who our firm could recommend to you for a certain territory, we'll be happy to supply you with recommendations. So hope you looked at this slide for your first code. And next we will talk about fire sprinklers and the different designs that are available for the fire sprinkler systems. You'll see when you look at a fire sprinkler head, you can see them maybe in your office or at a hotel. You'll see the bulb that is in the fire sprinkler head itself. And the bulbs pertain to specific temperature ratings. And you can see the different colors of the bulbs have different temperature ratings. And the sprinkler heads, they're held closed by a heat sensitive bulb. In the heat, the glass bulb is it applies the pressure to a pipe cap, and it acts as a plug, and it prevents the water from flowing until a certain ambient temperature around the sprinkler reaches the design activation temperature, and then the bulb breaks as a result of the thermal expansion inside. So for example, where it says 135 to 170 degrees, then you'll see a red or an orange bulb inside the fire sprinkler head. Once that temperature in the surrounding area reaches that temperature, then it will break. And then that's what starts the flow of the water to that particular fire sprinkler head. And then the different degrees, and then it changes the colors. So one of the things that you'll have to do, and your fire sprinkler expert will let you know whether or not the proper temperature rated head was used for a certain occupancy. And the different types of occupancy are light hazard, which are office buildings, and then you have an ordinary group, which is first or second category, which are libraries, stockrooms, restaurants, service areas. They would have different types of designs, fire sprinkler designs, than an extra hazardous group like an aircraft hangar and particle board manufacturing, because these different types of buildings are going to have different needs if there is a fire in those properties. So what are the different types of designs? There are different types of sprinklers, and you can have failures. We're going to talk about dry pipe and wet pipe systems, and then we're going to explain the spacing and the design considerations that can contribute to failures. Can have to do with the spacing of the fire sprinkler heads themselves, and the sloping. And what that means is that the sloping can come into play in a fire sprinkler loss, particularly in a dry pipe system, if the design records are not followed accurately and sloped, so that once water does enter into the system, it doesn't drain properly. So then water will accumulate in a dry pipe system, and if the temperature freezes in an area and that water is trapped in there because it's not sloped properly to drain, that can also cause a fire sprinkler loss. So that's just something else that your fire sprinkler expert will look out for. The fire sprinkler expert will also consider the hydraulic calculations. That's the amount of water input or output to a certain area, to see if it was properly designed to supply the water that is needed to certain areas. And hangers, the hangers will hold up the piping of the fire sprinkler line, like in a run of the piping, and that the hangers have a lot to do with the sloping of the fire sprinkler lines as well, because if the hangers are not properly positioned in the right areas, that can cause the sloping to be off as well. And now the different types of fire sprinklers that we have are the wet pipes. The wet pipes, there's constant water in a wet pipe at all times. This is the most common that you see. It's the cheapest kind. It has less maintenance than any other system. The dry pipe system, that is where once smoke is identified into the system, then the water pressure will be allowed to flow through the system, and then you will have a wet pipe, and then it will supply water through the pipes. A pre-action system is used when you do not want an accidental activation, such as a place of like a museum or a library. So two things have to happen before water is entered into a system. So a pre-action system is a combination of a dry system, and then it becomes a wet system. It takes more than one event to trigger the activation of the fire sprinkler system. And then the complete opposite of that is really a deluge sprinkler system. That's where all fire sprinkler heads activate at any given time whenever there is a loss. So, and that would be in an ultra hazardous area like an air hangar, because once you have a fire, you want to put it out and just flood the whole area. That makes it an ultra hazardous. It's kind of a rare thing, the deluge sprinkler system. And I recently had a loss that the deluge system was set up in an auditorium, and it was an odd situation, and it actually was allowed by the local building department. So it flooded the entire auditorium instead of just like putting out a fire like where the actual fire had occurred. And then we're going to talk about the wet pipe sprinkler system uses and the different types of failures that we see. The wet pipe sprinkler are used in heated portions of the building because they have to maintain temperatures of 40 degrees or above. So they can't be in areas that are subjected to freezing unless there is antifreeze solution that is used in the fire sprinkler pipes, or heat, or that heat would be provided. In the NFPA 2013 edition, they noted that the freeze protection is not required if an engineer confirms that the area will not be subject to 40 degrees or below. That is a fairly recent NFPA regulation. For those of us who have been working with fire sprinkler losses for many years, we have seen a trend of the NFPA requirements getting more stringent over the years, because the Southern Florida Building Code, for example, they do not build buildings and properties like they do up north, say for instance, like in New Hampshire, Connecticut, because those properties up there have more requirements to maintain and to prevent fire sprinkler pipes from freezing. The protection on the Southern Florida Building Code is not that great, and that's why we see a lot more fire sprinkler water losses in the south of the country than you do in the north of the country. The wet pipe sprinkler also requires the least amount of maintenance. And the different types of failures that you'll see in wet pipe sprinklers, you can see over a period of time leaks that occur at connection points. This could occur, the date of loss could be tricky to identify, where you have possibly a leak at a connection point. If it's a slow drip and then eventually somebody notices that a ceiling tile is accumulating moisture, and then eventually water stains. So if there is a leak at a connection point, that's something, that is one type of a failure. Sprinkler lines themselves can freeze and break, even though they're not supposed to be in temperatures under 40 degrees. That's a lot of times that we see that they are in attic spaces or somewhere else in the building. They could just be up on a close to a north wall, and still it gets cold enough over a long period of time. I'm sure that a lot of you on the phone right now have handled quite a few freeze losses this past year. We've had a lot of really, really cold conditions for prolonged periods of time. And we see the lines themselves break, and we see or they can freeze and break at an angle, at a connection point too. I've had quite a few sprinkler head losses, where that's typically where contractors accidentally bump them, somebody hits it. I've had a couple of cases in hotels where people hang their clothes, use a hanger. They think it's like a coat rack or something, and they put their hanger up through the fire sprinkler head. And when I go to hotels now, I see signs all over the place. They're kind of hanging from the fire sprinkler heads in the room. This is not a hanger, and it has a hanger, like a big cross through it, like a circle. Like, do not put a hanger up here. I've had a lot of good cases, subrogation cases that way. But mostly people hitting them. I have had one fire sprinkler head loss where a fire sprinkler installer used the wrong fire sprinkler temperature head. They used a lower setting of a head, and it should have been for a hotter temperature. So we had a successful subrogation claim against the fire sprinkler installer because he didn't use the appropriate fire sprinkler head. I've looked at a couple or a few, they did not go anywhere, of manufacturing defects of sprinkler heads. There just wasn't enough, supporting data to prove it. I have not had any successful fire sprinkler manufacturing defect cases. They haven't come across my desk, but maybe, you folks have had those. And then fire sprinkler leaks. So those are some of the common ways that the wet sprinkler pipes can fail. And then we will talk about the dry pipe sprinkler system uses and failures. And if you're looking down and not looking at the screen right now, I highly recommend that you look at the screen, because there is one of the code words that you will need to fill out on your final affidavit that we will submit to you after this presentation. So we're going to talk about dry pipe sprinkler systems uses and their failures. Okay, here goes the second code. And the dry pipe are used in non-heated areas, up in your attics, parking garages, stairwells, anything where the temperatures cannot be maintained at 40 degrees or above. Right away, when I get a fire sprinkler loss, like I said earlier, I want to know if it's a wet pipe or a dry pipe system, because a dry pipe should always be dry. A dry pipe should never have water in it. That's the biggest subrogation alert that I could stress to you today. The dry pipes do require more installation, they require more testing, and they require more maintenance. The air pressure in a dry pipe is what is, there's air pressure inside of the dry pipe. It's not just like an empty void space. It's constantly being pressurized by air. In the air, it holds down a clapper valve and it keeps the water back from the pipe itself. And then once an air pressure is lost because of an activation, like smoke or something is entered into the system, then that clapper will fall down, and then it allows the water to flow. And then if you have a freeze and a break in a dry pipe, again, that's bad, because there should be no water in it at all. And as a result of that air pressure that is in the dry pipe, it creates condensation and will build up moisture inside of the dry pipe. So it permits itself to corrosion over a period of time. And there is more engineering involved with the installation. They really have to make sure that the sloping is proper, that it is so that the water can drain out of the system during the testing that occurs of the dry pipe systems. Water gets introduced into the dry pipe system. These are mandates by the local fire marshal's office. These systems have to be checked continuously to make sure that they are in safe operating condition, because they are life safety measures of a property owner when they have invitees in their buildings. In the case that they have a fire, they have to be able to quickly extinguish the fire and take care of their invitees and get them to safety. And as a result, the owner of the property has a duty to have these systems tested and maintained. And we'll talk about that further, that the responsibility does fall back on the owner. This can be problematic for subrogation because it is the responsibility of our insured owner if we insure the owner and the landlord. Now, another avenue of recovery would be if you're insured as a tenant and the lease allows for a cause of action against the landlord, and a landlord did not properly maintain a system and you had a water loss at your insured's property. You may have a good argument and supporting evidence to bring a claim against a landlord in a landlord-tenant situation if you were insured as the tenant and the landlord had the duty to maintain that. So some of the things to look at in the dry pipe fire sprinkler claims is the installation is critical, like I stressed previously, because if the installation is not right, the water will not evacuate from the system after it's tested. And it has to be tested, a flow test, at least once a year. The owner or a service contractor maintenance person has to do this flow test. And the owner is responsible for it. No, let me take that back. A certified service contractor has to conduct the flow test. The owner has to maintain the system at all times. A lot of times your owners of the building, your insureds, they will hire service maintenance contractors. But at the time that the maintenance comes around, when the pipes have to be constantly checked to make sure that they are dry, because condensation will build up and condensation has to be drained off the dry pipes on a regular basis. And that is the duty and the responsibility of the insured. So that's why I put up here at the top of the slide of installation versus maintenance issue. You could have sloping that is a problem with the installation, coupled with the landowner or the landlord not maintaining it properly or draining the water off of the system because of the condensation that builds up. That's going to be an issue that hopefully can be clarified for you by your fire sprinkler protection engineer. They know what to look for as far as the sloping and then the maintenance and where the water accumulated in the particular system that caused the failure. Because of the condensation and the moisture in the piping, mentioned here that the corrosion in the pipe, does occur, and the pipes are subject to moisture and water buildup in the pipe. What happens is that the moisture in the pipe will flow to the lowest point. That's why the sloping is important. And at the lowest end of the point, there are things that are called drip drums or valves, drum valve drips. You'll hear different type of lingo used in the industry. And what it is, it's a low point and it's a valve, so that the landlord, usually the landlord's, say there's a building engineer or it's service maintenance person on board at the property, has to go around periodically, check these low point valves and drain water off of them to keep them free of water. If you have an insured who keeps a log of that maintenance, that's wonderful. Sometimes we do see insureds who have immaculate records. It makes it a lot easier on everybody. So that's why the installation is critical, so that the water can properly be drained off of the system. And then we need to know and we need to understand the duties and the responsibilities of the owners and the maintenance contractor. And the service maintenance contractor, a lot of their contracts will have information that they are responsible for the testing of the system on an annual basis, like a flow test that I mentioned, where water is introduced into the system. And then they also have to have semi-annual tests in most jurisdictions, according to the fire marshal, again, for life safety purposes. So the systems are constantly being checked. So there should be a good amount of records available. If the insured doesn't have them, you may be able to get them directly from the service maintenance contractors. And sometimes over a period of years, as you know, there could be various service maintenance contractors as well. A lot of the contracts that we see for the service contractors, because they do the testing and the inspection, will specifically exclude, and I'm using finger quotes, the maintenance. And the maintenance of a system goes and falls on the responsibility on the owner of the system. That has to do with draining the system on a regular basis. So a lot of these fire sprinkler companies, there's some big names out there. I'm not going to mention them, but if you've been doing this for a while, you've seen the big company names, and their contracts are written very well by very well-trained attorneys that waive everything, all subrogation claims. They use the verbiage directly out of the NFPA guidelines and place the responsibilities appropriately and as much as they can on the owners of the building. So just be aware and get your contracts over to your subrogation attorneys. If you have any questions, I mean, that's what we're here for. We're a team working with you guys. So now we will talk about some of the different codes and the authorities. Just remember that there are codes, and then there are local jurisdictional codes and authorities that will apply to your insured property. And some of the different codes that we see for the fire sprinkler claims involve the international fire code. There's an international residential code, and there's also an international building code. And the different jurisdictions, what they do is, say, for example, you're in Dallas, Texas, and you go to the building department, and then you ask the building department, okay, which codes apply to this particular building? and they'll say, oh, well, we've adopted all the rules and the laws of the International Fire Code. So there's a start. And then a lot of times they'll adopt the International Building Code, and you'll hear it referred to as the IBC. A lot of people just refer to it by the abbreviations. But then they'll also have some local Dallas, Texas rules. Some of them are similar. Sometimes they take the same exact verbiage out of these fire codes, and then they insert them into their own codes. So your experts are going to be a huge resource for you to accumulate and to figure out what all the codes are pertaining to all the issues involving a fire sprinkler system. For example, the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Code, 17, there's different numbers that are involved for different reasons or different purposes of your fire sprinkler system. So the NFPA 17 is for the standard for the dry, wet chemical. And the dry and the wet chemical systems you'll see in kitchens and restaurants. That's a type of one of the NFPA guidelines. Okay, the NFPA 13 is the standard for the installation of a fire sprinkler system. So these are all the rules and all the rules and the laws that are involving the installation. Now, there are 3 different types that they have the NFPA 13 guidelines. The plain NFPA 13 commercial apply to all commercial type settings. That's where your occupancy is a commercial loss and not a residential loss. And then for the NFPA 13R for the residential, those are the rules pertaining to that. They have different requirements. I know in Florida, any 3-story building that is a residence must have a fire sprinkler system in it now. Condominiums, townhomes, regular standalone residential properties, those are the current codes in Florida. So you will see fire sprinkler systems in residential properties as well. And then the NFPA 13D, that's for 1 or 2 family dwellings. That is also, they have different fire sprinkler installation guidelines for the 1 and 2 family dwellings that are a little bit different than the regular residential. So the NFPA 13, the protection from freezing, this is where you'll get a lot of information from your fire sprinkler engineers, and you've heard us talk about it over and over again today. It's the importance of a dry pipe is not supposed to have water in it. And a dry pipe is required if an area is subject to 40 degrees or below. And that is the 1999 edition. So as I talked about earlier, how we have seen the NFPA evolve over the years, from the 2013 to the 1999 edition, you'll see that it has changed quite a bit, and that they're trying to really put some responsibility on the engineer of record who builds the property. That if the owner wants to get away from, like putting a heated system in an area to keep a pipe from freezing, or requiring or adding antifreeze to a system, because all these things are going to cost more money. With the 2013 edition, the freeze protection is not required if the engineer confirms it. So if there's no freeze protection and your building is subjected to the 2013 NFPA provision, you want to get your hands on that engineering confirmation, and that would be your subrogation target. You could go after the engineer as well as whoever the installer is if your contracts don't waive any subrogation. So of course you have to get over those hurdles as well. And you know that's the biggest thing is that we see these we'll see wet pipe systems that are in areas that are not supposed to be subject to 40 degrees or below, but we see time and time again where you have extreme weather conditions, you get the wind blowing from the north side, and you'll see a lot of fire sprinkler water losses as a result of this. They're not supposed to be in areas that are colder than 40 degrees, but it happens. So here is our last and our final code word for today. It is at the bottom of the slide that we're on right now, in case you haven't taken a look at the screen. It is up there right now. So please take a look at the screen. This is the last of the 3 of your codes that we will have you write down and return to our office. Jackie Bing, like I said earlier, she'll send you an email following this webinar, and you have to provide her with the 3 code words along with your CE adjuster license information, and we'll submit that for you. And there we go. So the inspection, testing, and maintenance is also included in NFPA 25. Up here you can see the different editions. They don't update the NFPA guidelines every year. It's whenever they have enough changes or amendments that they put out a new publication. So there's one from 1998. You'll see the next one is 2002, and then it jumps to 2008. So there's really no rhyme or reason as to when it comes out. But maybe it looks like the past 4 have come out every 3 years. Maybe they've just had enough changes or additions to it. We have worked with some of the authors of the NFPA guidelines and had them involved in litigation. Those are great guys to testify for you about the standards of the NFPA. So it was really fun and interesting working with them. As you can see, in all the editions, the owner is responsible for maintaining the system. So it's critical that the water is drained off of that. And it doesn't say in the NFPA guidelines it as to when or how often. It's like as needed. So you have to know your own system. And they have to do a good job of keeping that water off of there. Or if they're subjected to freezing temperatures, they will have losses or repeated losses. I have an insured, they're on their 3rd loss right now because they have different losses in different locations of the building, and they have a lot of buildings in one particular complex. And they just keep having multiple losses in different buildings. And a repair contractor does not have a duty to go in and add heat or, bring things up to a higher standard in an older building. So it can be a problem. And it can be a repeated problem once you have a fire sprinkler freeze loss. If something isn't changed, it could be a repeat of loss events out there at the insured property. So that's probably something for a different department of the insurance company to look into. It doesn't really have to do with subrogation, maybe underwriting, but if a repair contractor, did go that further step and change perhaps some of the sloping or from a prior loss event, that might be an area for subrogation recovery. You just have to take a look at the facts and see. But the loss location that I had, it was repeat water losses, were only because they were in different buildings and different areas of the fire sprinkler, because there's fire sprinkler lines, different runs, and they're not always on the same run of line piping, and they all can be in separate locations, but ultimately tied into one system. Could be on a different floor. And so if a repair contractor fixed the second floor, but then you had a loss on the fifth floor, the repair contractor wouldn't have a duty who made repairs on the second floor to go up and make sure the system was protected properly on the fifth floor of the building. So that would be unrelated. So it's just something to think about. Hopefully insureds will be proactive and not want to have their building subjected to another freeze. And sometimes they just do what they have to do to make sure that those wet pipes are maintained at a proper heat, or they start draining their systems better and maintaining them better. Let's see here. So those are more on this slide here, the different NFPA provisions. It just goes over the section about the maintaining the minimum temperature of 40 degrees and not exposed to freezing conditions. And there's that last NFPA provision that you'll see over again: dry systems shall be kept at all times. So it's very important. These are life safety measures, that the insureds have to comply with once they are the landlord. And if they are a tenant in the building, sometimes there is subrogation recovery against the landlord. And sometimes you can have subrogation actions against the service maintenance contractors too. So I hope that today was helpful to everybody. And that is the end of the presentation of quick investigating tips for fire sprinkler claims.